Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. If you have watched any of my tutorials before, thank you so much. If you are joining me for the first time, welcome. If you're just watching the process because that's something you like to do, that's totally fine. Hopefully you'll paint along with me and perhaps you can relax and create and do your own little painting session at home completely free of charge. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Here are some of the colors that I've used. I'll take you through exactly which ones. You definitely don't need to have every single one of these colors to start off. You're going to need some greens, maybe a turquoise, blues, white, yellow, and then you need a range of brushes. Now I've got a few different brushes that I use quite often here, including things like filbert brushes, flat brushes, round brushes, fan brushes, and some thin liner brushes, and then a couple of bigger ones to do the backgrounds. I use 2 pots of water so that I can keep my brushes nice and clean, especially when I'm working with light colors. And these brushes I use as what we call dry brushes or blending brushes, and it smooths out some of the maybe streakiness that you can get from when you're painting with acrylic paint or any paint really. They're a lot softer, and those ones are actually makeup brushes. So I've gone over my canvas with white. I've used some painter's tape. You do not have to use painter's tape if you don't want to. You can just draw a line. You can just rule a line right in the center of your canvas. And I'm using some cobalt blue, and I'm also using an aqua blue blended in with some white. I'm just starting off with streaks. We want a nice, clear, beautiful summer sky today. So I'm starting off with streaks of different cobalt blue and the aqua blue. I want my edges and my top to be a little bit darker than the horizon line. I want the horizon line to be misty. Now I've gone over those streaks with these dry brushes or these blending brushes, and you can see how it makes the texture much softer. We get a much softer finish, and it's all blended together nicely, so it has that subtle look of clouds. If you want to go over this with a few different cloudy streaks like I am doing at the moment, you can. If you don't want to do that and you really love that soft, misty sky with just those hints of fluffy clouds, you can absolutely leave them. I'm just showing you a couple of different techniques if you would like to experiment. Now I'm just going across the bottom with a clean brush, just with white, starting right at that horizon line where I put the tape and then pulling upwards so it sort of fades into that blue sky. We want a little bit of that. We want a little bit of clouds and mist happening. Beautiful, clear summer's day. Going over it with white just that little bit more. We will do some background mountains as well. So it's nice to have a light background so that you can do that. Now I've put some more painter's tape to protect the horizon line of the sky, and I'm starting on my sand. I'm using sweeping diagonal motions with a round brush, a round bristle brush. And those 2 colors are, you can see there's a little bit of blue that's sort of come into it with when I picked it up off my palette, totally okay. It's a tiny bit of neon yellow and white and some cool yellow, neon yellow and white to create our base. Now I'm using a turquoise green and some of that aqua blue to create our water. I wanted very calm waters. This is supposed to be sort of a serene picture with the waves coming up on the shore. So I've started with the aqua blue and I've made it a little bit darker. So at the back near the tape, that's where I've started, and I've swept left and right and pulled down so you can see how it's sort of starting to blend into the sand. Now I'm using a fan brush with just the turquoise, so you can see those little shadows, and also going through with some white to create to make the water look glittery and to give us that illusion or that look of those calm waves at the top of the water. In the center, I'm going in with a little bit more white and making those streaks a little bit brighter so that when we paint in the sun at the end, it looks like the reflection of the sun on the water. And you want a few streaks, a few soft faded streaks like I'm doing. And then you also want a few little white dots because that starts to look like little glittery bits on the surface of the water, which is always very beautiful. And I just went right at the back with my turquoise and now some cobalt blue. The back should be darker, and then as it gets closer to us, it should become lighter. And that darker blue will look very nice against the white that we did on our horizon line. I made the bottom lighter. I went over it with that white, so there'll be a nice contrast between them. Adding in a few more details with my fan brush. Try not to do too many, try not to overdo it, but you do want enough so that it starts to give the illusion that there's these soft, ripply waves. Now I'm picking up some of that turquoise green and using a flat brush and starting to paint in or just block in the direction of the waves that I want. The trick here is that the ripples will be closer together and almost more like on the edges, they'll almost be horizontal lines. So from the edges, they will be closer together and almost horizontal lines. And then as you get closer to the middle of the canvas where the waves are lapping up, then the space between those ripples or those waves becomes slightly wider, and also the direction that they go is more to the bottom of the canvas rather than off to the side of the canvas. And that's how you create that consistency of the direction of the waves coming through. Now I'm using some aqua blue to create some darkness and depths and shadows of the waves. So if you look at the lines I'm doing, that line on the left with the yellow, those yellow highlights that I'm starting to do, you can see that one that's pulled straight across, it's almost horizontal. And then as my lines get closer to the middle of the canvas, they're almost vertical. And that way the direction will be consistent with the direction of the waves that are meeting the shore. I've used a tiny bit of those colors are cool yellow mixed in with a tiny bit of that turquoise, just to start creating some highlights. See how I'm using my flat brush and almost going straight down, still slightly off on a diagonal slant to keep consistent with the directions of the waves. Now I'm going in with some white. I'm not using a lot of white paint, so I'm not loading up my brush too much because we want it to look soft and foamy. Now I'm using a smaller flat brush here, and I'm using that because if you use the edge of a flat brush, you can get sharp lines. And then if you turn the brush around, you can create a wider line. So I'm using the wider angle or wider part of the brush when I do that foam, like I'm doing right now. And then when I create the ripples or the waves, I turn my brush on its side and use it as a sharp edge to create those directions. So you can see in the middle, as I'm getting to the middle, the white lines are further between each other. So there's a bigger gap between them, and they are heading towards the bottom of the canvas. Still on that same diagonal slant. But just slightly at a different angle. So the technique here is to go in and do your white foam first, and you just need to dab and tap. It doesn't need to be perfect. Waves aren't perfect and we want it to look like foam, so dab and tap to create those little clusters of white foam, and then drag your brush back on that sharp edge to create the direction of the foam and the waves. I'm going in with some more white just to layer it. The more you layer it, the better it starts to look. If you do feel like you lose some of the highlights, or you've done too many highlights, or you've done too many shadows, totally okay. You can always go back and just play around with it until you're happy with it. Now I'm going in with some shadows on our foam. We want to create depth, we want to create layers, we want to create a different look. And this is where the waves are sort of crashing onto the sand. So they are going to look a little bit different. Quite often, if you've been to the beach before, we can see that once the waves crash onto the shore, there's more foam, they're whiter, and there's that little clustery ripple effect. Now I'm going through with some shadows to create a bit of depth. I'm using the cobalt blue. Now I'm extending those ripples. So the white lines or the white ripples that I have done from the foam all the way to the back, I'm just extending them just that little bit so that they all blend in so that it looks like one body of water. Same principle as well. So the white, any line, whether it's the white line or the shadows or the turquoise or the cobalt blue that I'm doing now, you'll find that the lines that I do are a little bit thicker the closer we get to the bottom of the canvas because they are closer to us. And then the lines and the ripples that are further away are thinner and lighter. We want to start to create different layers of color in the ocean so that we can see the depth and the shadows of the waves, and then also the highlights and where the sun is hitting it. And I'm using the same 3 colors so that it's all consistent. I'm using cobalt blue, I'm using an aqua blue, I'm using a little bit of cool yellow as we get closer to the sand, and I'm also using white. So you can see how I've started to extend those ripples towards the back of the water, the body of water at the back. Now I'm going in with some depth and some shadows. At the front, we want little clusters. So little clusters of shadow, little clusters of brightness, and that makes it look like foam. And then we want it to taper off into those little ripples and lines to look like waves. Now I'm adding some shadows just underneath the foam. Now I'm going in with a little bit of cool yellow and white. I'm using the cool yellow because sometimes waves are transparent and we can see the sand underneath them. Now I'm creating some more foam with the white. So I've gone in with my white and blocked in where I want those highlights to be. Then I've gone in and done my shadows, including some shadows just under the foam, because it is all rolling onto the water. So if it was just white, we wouldn't be able to see that distinction between the foam and the highlights, or not as well, not as nice. Now I'm going over with some highlights near where our depth is. So I'm trying to leave those shadows and those lovely dark blue lines that we did. And now I'm going in with some highlights close to them or just on top of them to create those little distinct lines that start to look like waves. Foaming at the front and then tapering it back off. So again, you can see here how my lines are flatter, almost in line with the horizon line on the edges. They are closer to a horizontal line. And then as we get into the middle, even though they're still on that diagonal slant, they are pointing more towards the bottom of the canvas. And that way it looks like the wave is all going in the same direction. Just adding a few more highlights to where I'm going to put my sun. A little bit more yellow, partly the yellow from the sun's rays and also to tie it in with the sand at the bottom. Now over that white and neon yellow that's now mostly dry, I've used some cool yellow and some warm yellow. And I'm coming in the corners because we want our corners to be darker. And just starting to layer it up to make it look more like sand, so less flat and giving it some perspective. I'm using some burnt umber there just to create some shadow, maybe like people have walked along the beach and along the ocean's line. Again, using the darker color at the bottom and then layering over it with some warm yellow and some cool yellow. I want to try and leave close to those waves. I want to try and make sure that I leave that beautiful, vibrant, lighter neon yellow mixed in with white, because that's where most of the light is hitting. Now just blending all of that together with some white. All you need to do for this technique are some left and right sweeping strokes, some curved strokes. Just keep in mind you want it to be darker on the edges and darker at the bottom of the canvas, and then as we get closer to where the sand meets the water, we want to keep that lighter. I'm just using a flat brush here, just dabbing and tapping, sweeping, until I get that sandy texture that I want. If for some reason you don't really like the outcome of your sand, or you don't feel like there's enough variance in the textures or the values or the shadows, you can use a hairdryer and let it dry again, and you can start again and you can layer over it. Sometimes it's nice to do this while the paint is still wet, because you can blend it in a little bit easier and you can create that effect. Okay, last but not least, I'm using one of those makeup brushes. It is what would look like a filbert brush, which is sort of like a flat brush, but the edges, instead of being straight across, it's sort of rounded, but this is a very soft, fluffy brush. So I'm going in with some white just to blend that last part of the ocean or the waves or the foam into the sand, just fading off some of that foam. And then also going in with some burnt umber to create a few shadows, so we can see the edges of those waves or the foam that is coming onto the sand. So you can see I keep swapping colors. I just clean my brush, so I use my burnt umber to create the shadow, and then when I want to create that contrast, because you can see if you look right in the middle where that burnt umber meets the white, there's that really beautiful highlight, and there's that lovely contrast between being able to see the edges of the foam and then the shadow underneath it. Now we are creating our mountains. I have not loaded up my brush very much. I'm using that same makeup, that soft makeup brush. If you don't have a brush exactly like that, that's okay. You should be able to use most brushes to create a similar effect. And I am using the aqua blue, and I started out with the aqua blue mixed in with quite a bit of white, so it is that way those mountains in the background look more, they look further away because they are lighter. So the further something is from us, the lighter they are. You do want to make sure that you can see them against the sky, which is why I've used that aqua blue, whereas the majority of the sky, I think I use a bit more cobalt blue than the aqua blue. So I've created those background mountains on the horizon. Now I'm using a stipple brush, and I have mixed a medium green with a tiny bit of black paint. That's going to be our base, that's going to be our darkest green. And I've just stippled a couple of little bushes on the side. Now we're drawing in our first palm tree. I have used some burnt umber, which is a dark brown, mixed in with a little bit of warm yellow. I'm just blocking in where we want the trunk of that palm tree to go. Now I'm using a flat brush and creating some shadows with the burnt umber. Now I'm using the warm yellow to create a highlight, and you can see the direction of my brush, the technique I'm using is to sort of dab and tap in horizontally across the trunk, and that creates what looks like the texture of the bark. Now I'm using white as our highlight just on the edge. I've drawn a line and then I'm softening it up with that same technique, just dabbing and tapping, using little flicks to start creating that texture so it looks rough like bark. Going in with some highlights. I'm just layering it up until I'm sort of happy with the result. Now, I've decided that I think the sun is hitting on the left and the right, because the sun is going to be in the center at the top of the canvas. So we're going to have both the left and the right side of the trunk with some highlights, and then the shadows are going to be the back of the trunk, which is facing up, because that's where the least light hits. So that's where I've tried to do that. Now I'm using a flat brush and that same dark green that I used for those shrubs down the bottom, and I'm drawing in the lines for where I want all my leaves to go. Just marking them in so we have a guide. Now I've got one palm tree on the left, and then I want the leaves to look a lot closer to us on the right. Still using that same flat brush and still using that same medium green or sap green with a tiny bit of black through it. That's going to be our base to create that depth and those shadows. Then we will go over them with some highlights. Loading up my brush and then using my flat brush so that we get a thicker line. And then I'm twisting my flat brush so that we get those sharp edges on the end of each one of those leaves. And I'm using those lines that I've drawn in as a guide. So you use more pressure where it's closer to those lines that are guiding us, and then release that pressure and flick back, and that will create that look where we've got that pointed look of the leaf. Making sure that they're nice and sharp on the edges, that it's all extended. Now I'm mixing in, it's a medium green, but it's a little bit lighter with some neon yellow, and these are going to be our highlights. I want the highlights to be on the tops of the leaves, closer to the top. Definitely does not have to be perfect, but we want to make sure that we are keeping some of that depth, that we can see the shadow behind it. Those layers are really what start to bring it to life, to give it that 3D perspective. So again, that lighter green with some neon yellow. We want them to look like they're glowing against the sun. Now I'm using neon yellow, mostly neon yellow here, on the edges, on the tips of the leaves. The tips and the tops. We want to be able to see all three of those different layered colours that we've done. We want to see depth with that dark green. We want to see some of that medium green, nice and vibrant, so they look like healthy leaves. And then we want the glow of the sun's rays on them as well. So I've stuck to one side. If you look at those leaves down the bottom, you can see that I have the right side of each leaf is darker, and then it is lighter on the left side. When you keep it consistent like that, it looks like it looks more realistic, like the light is hitting on a particular part of the leaf. I decided that we needed maybe one more, and you can do that too. If you think that your leaves are enough, you can leave them. If your leaves are going in a slightly different direction to mine, that's okay. If you have slightly different colors, if you don't have neon colors and you just want to use cool yellow mixed with some white to create the highlights, you can. If you've watched any of my other tutorials, you'll know that I am a lover of neon paints. I think that they're brilliant and they're fun and they create a wonderful glow. Now I'm using a fan brush, the same green, so that sap green or that medium green with a little bit of black mixed into it. And I am just using sweeping motions. So starting at the line at the center of each one of those leaves and flicking outwards. And that creates the base of our palm tree leaves. It's nice and quick, that technique. Fan brushes are wonderful because they create several different leaves at simultaneously. Now I'm going in with some warm yellow, trying to leave some of that depth in the background, but starting to create some of those highlights. See how you can definitely still see some of the depth at the back. Now using some of that mid-green. We want our leaves to look very vibrant. We want the palm tree to look very healthy. So we can still see some of that depth in the background. We can still see some of that yellow, still see some of those highlights. Going in with a little bit of neon yellow to match the leaves on the right side. Create that consistency. I'm using a flat brush for that, but I will go back to my fan brush in just a second. Last but not least, some white highlights. So now we can see each one of now with the white highlights, you can see how it creates little edges of those leaves simultaneously, just with a few different flicks. And you can still see all of the colors. We've got a bit of the depth that we started with. We can see that medium green. We can see some of the warm green, some of the neon yellow, some of the warm yellow. And that completes our palm tree. That was nice and quick. Going over our base color to create some mid-green highlights, trying to leave some of that depth using my stipple brush again. Now I'm using some neon yellow just on the tops. That's where the most light is going to be hitting. Going in with some white and a tiny bit of yellow, tiny bit, just to tint it. Now we've got our shrubs there. This is a technique that you can use to paint flowers. You don't have to do it this way. You can do it a different way if you like. You don't have to do flowers at all if you want to do something else. If you look at my palette, I've got some red and then some white, and I'm loading up my brush. And on one side of my brush, there is red, and on the other side of my brush, there is white. And I make sure that whatever colors, you don't have to use these two colors, you can use different colors. But the darker color needs to go on the inside of the flower and the lighter color needs to go on the outside. And all I'm doing is placing my brush. You kind of have to do it in one motion, and I am turning my canvas around to get the right angle. You place your brush on the canvas, and then you move your hand up and down, so up and down in little strokes, and moving across. You'll see me do it. You'll see me do it for the next flower, and I'll do a close-up for you as well. So once you've created these little shells, I think these are nice flowers to do because it's sort of reminiscent of shells on the beach. So once you've created the petals all the way around, then we're creating the middle or the center of the flower. And the way I am doing that is that same technique. I'm using a smaller flat brush for this. For the petals, you probably want to use a wider flat brush so you get that coverage, depending on how big you would like your flowers to be. And all I've done for the center of that flower is a very similar technique. So on one side of my brush is white and the other side of my brush is red. And I've made sure that the lightest color or the white is pointing outwards. And I have created the first thing I did was create a little frown, and then I loaded up my brush again and then created a little curly smile, and that creates what looks like that little, almost like a little cylinder in the center. Now I'm using the same technique, except I am just doing one swipe, one motion. Again, as long as the lightest color is on the outside, that's where the light is hitting, and that will create your flower. I'm doing another flower. This one won't be quite as detailed. I wanted it to look different. Using red in the middle and then using neon yellow on the outside. So I'm creating those little arches. You can see the movements that I'm making with my hand, up, down, and moving across. So it creates almost what looks like a little fan for each one of the petals. Make sure you wash your brush in between every petal that you do, because otherwise then the colors will mix together and just create an orange, and you won't have that lovely contrast and distinction between the darker color and the lighter color on the outside. You can wait for your painting to dry completely before you do this if you like. You can see with mine it's mixed in. I was too impatient, so I thought I would go in and just do it. Then I used white and the end of one of my brushes. I dipped it in some white paint and then dotted on the center of the flower. Now I am using that dark green that I created, mostly black with some medium green in it, and I'm using the similar technique in where there is green on one side of my brush and then the darker color, the black, on the other side of the brush, and I am creating those leaves by applying pressure and then releasing that pressure and flicking out. And then we have those two distinct colors of the leaves. Doing a couple of little curly cues with that darker, just to finish it off, little curls. This is close up of what this technique looks like. So I have red on one side of my brush and then yellow on the other side of my brush. making sure I wash my brush in between. Then creating those little arches with one motion. You have to keep reloading your brush, otherwise you won't get it as thick or as vibrant. So reloading my brush and then just going 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4 little arches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can do this with any two colors. Just keep in mind that the darker color should be on the inside and the lighter color should be on the outside. I wanted those to look, I do want them to be flowers, but I also wanted them to be reminiscent of shells on the beach. So again, using that aqua blue and white, darker color on the inside, lighter color facing out. And now creating those leaves again. So dipping my brush half in that dark green with the black and half into the medium green. You can see how I place pressure with that flat brush, using a flat brush, placing pressure and then flicking out. And a couple of little curly cues. I think that little detail finishes it off. A few more blades, a few more leaves. Now, because I used yellow on the sand, I just wanted to be able to see the edges of my flower. So I went around them with yellow. If you have chosen a different color and you're happy with the result, you don't necessarily need to do that. Now I'm just using warm yellow and some cool yellow to create some highlights on the leaves and on the little curly strands, little curly things that we did. I wanted the middle of this flower to be different, so I started by dotting it with some white paint using the end of my brush, and then using a fine liner brush just to extend that paint out while it's still wet, and that creates the center. Now you don't have to use your finger if you don't want to create the moon. I just find it easy to make it into a round circle that is even, so I use my finger, but if you want to use a paintbrush to create the sun, you can do that. And then I used the fan brush to flick out the beginnings of some sun rays. I do love my sun rays. You will have seen it if you've watched some of my other tutorials, there's usually almost some sun rays somewhere. So if you don't want to do the sun rays, you definitely don't have to. And now I'm using a flat brush, and I'm not using a lot of white paint, trying to use very little so that when you flick it out, you can see the water. You want the sun rays to be somewhat transparent. They're going to be thicker and brighter the closer they are to the sun, but then as they extend out, we want them to be transparent. And that's it. There you have it. I hope you painted along with me today. If you didn't and you're still watching, that's okay, but thank you very much for watching my tutorials. And please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.